On April 1, 1943, the North African sky carried the sound of engines meant for war. From a dusty airfield near Biskra, Algeria, a formation of U.S. Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted into the morning haze. Their destination lay east, across the Mediterranean coastline of Tunisia, where Axis supply lines and airfields fed a desperate fight against Allied ground forces. The aircraft were heavy with fuel and bombs, their aluminum skins already stained by oil, sand, and long hours in combat zones. Inside each bomber, men adjusted flak vests, checked oxygen lines, and listened to the uneven rhythm of 4 Wright or 1820 engines pulling them toward hostile airspace. This was not a training flight. Tunisia in early 1943 was a killing ground. German fighter units, including experienced pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s, prowled the skies daily. Anti-aircraft batteries were dug into hills and roadsides, their crews trained to track the slow, high-altitude silhouettes of American bombers. Every man aboard knew the odds. A daylight bombing mission over Axis-held territory meant flak first, fighters second, and survival never guaranteed. One of the aircraft in the formation carried the nose art, the All-American. She was a B-17F assigned to the 97th Bomb Group, part of the 8th Air Force's expanding effort to cripple enemy logistics. Her crew had flown before. They understood formation discipline, interlocking fields of .50 caliber fire, and the narrow margin that separated a controlled bomber from a falling wreck. The cold at altitude bit through gloves and jackets as the aircraft climbed past 15,000 feet, oxygen masks sealing faces into quiet, mechanical focus. As the formation crossed the coastline, the Mediterranean faded beneath a layer of broken cloud. Radio chatter tightened. Gunners scanned the sky through frost-rimmed plexiglass, eyes straining for the first glint of movement. The bombers held steady speed and spacing, knowing that any break in formation invited disaster. Somewhere ahead, German radar stations were already tracking them, plotting altitude, heading, and timing. The first black bursts of flak appeared like sudden wounds in the sky. They were not yet accurate, but they were close enough to rattle fuselages and test nerves. Shrapnel clanged against wings and control surfaces, sharp metallic strikes echoing through the airframe. Then the call came over the interphone, fighters, high and fast. Silver shapes dove out of the sun. Bf-109s rolled and climbed with brutal precision, their cannons flashing as they closed the distance. Tracers reached for the bombers in long, burning lines. The All-American held her place in formation, guns answering with steady fire as the sky filled with smoke, vibration, and noise. In seconds, the mission crossed a line no one could step back from because one enemy aircraft was no longer turning away, but coming straight in. By the spring of 1943, the American air war over North Africa had reached a brutal turning point. The U.S. Army Air Forces were no longer testing tactics or probing defenses. They were pressing forward with daylight precision bombing, a doctrine built on faith in formations, firepower, and discipline. Tunisia was where that doctrine was being judged. Every mission carried the weight of expectation, and the cost of failure was written in burning wreckage scattered across desert and sea. At 20,000 feet, the bomber formation pushed deeper inland. The sky grew crowded with danger. German flak batteries tightened their aim, bursts climbing closer with every second. The explosions were no longer distant punctuation. They were close enough to rock the aircraft, close enough to shred control cables and puncture fuel tanks. Inside the bombers, the sound was constant engine roar layered with sharp impacts, interphone voices strained but controlled, men reporting damage in clipped, rehearsed language. The enemy fighters returned in waves. Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbed hard, rolled, and dove with practiced aggression. Their pilots had learned American patterns. They attacked from head-on angles, where the bombers' defenses were weakest and closing speeds were deadly. Nose gunners fired until barrels glowed, tracers stitching the air. Waist gunners leaned into their guns, fighting vibration and freezing wind as spent casings rattled across the floor. The All-American stayed in formation, her pilot holding position with steady hands. Breaking away meant isolation. Isolation meant death. Around her, other bombers began to show damage, holes torn through wings, engines trailing smoke, one aircraft slipping out of line as it lost altitude. There was no room for sympathy, no time to look back. The formation pressed on, because that was the only way any of them would survive. Inside the cockpit, the instruments told an unforgiving story. Airspeed fluctuated as turbulence and shockwaves hit the airframe. The control yoke vibrated constantly, fighting the pilot's grip. Oxygen masks fogged with breath. Every man aboard understood that this was the moment the air war balanced on a knife edge. The American strategy demanded resolve under pressure that bordered on the inhuman. Below them, the Tunisian landscape passed in sharp relief: ridges, roads, and scattered buildings already scarred by months of fighting. Somewhere down there, Allied troops were advancing, counting on these bombers to break resistance ahead of them. Failure in the air meant blood on the ground. Another attack formed ahead. One German fighter did not break off after firing. It stayed on course, closing distance rapidly. The angle was wrong. The speed was too high. The nose of the fighter grew larger in the windshield, its engine screaming, its pilot committed beyond retreat. Gunners shouted warnings. Tracers reached out, but the distance collapsed too fast. In that frozen instant, the doctrine, the training, and the faith in formation firepower were about to be tested in the most violent way imaginable, because the next second would decide whether the All-American remained an aircraft, or became history falling from the sky. The collision came without warning and without mercy. At nearly 300 miles per hour, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 struck the All-American from above and behind, metal tearing into metal with a violence that shook every bone inside the aircraft. The German fighter's engine and propeller ripped through the B-17's tail section, shredding control cables, severing the vertical stabilizer, and blasting away nearly half of the rear fuselage. In a fraction of a second, the bomber was no longer whole. It was broken in midair. Inside the aircraft, the impact felt like an explosion. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Loose equipment slammed across the floor. The tail gunner's position vanished in a storm of debris, open sky suddenly where aluminum skin had been. Wind howled through the ruptured fuselage, a deafening roar that overwhelmed engines and voices alike. Smoke and fragments spun backward into nothingness. The bomber lurched hard to one side, nose dipping as if gravity had finally claimed it. Training took over because panic would have killed them faster than the damage. The pilot fought the controls, discovering instantly that the aircraft no longer responded as it should. Elevator authority was gone. Rudder control was nearly non-existent. The B-17 flew, but only barely balanced on unstable air and sheer will. The co-pilot scanned instruments that no longer made sense, while the engineer shouted readings that bordered on disbelief. The bomber dropped out of formation. That alone was usually a death sentence. Isolated aircraft were torn apart by fighters within seconds. But the German fighter that caused the damage never pulled away. It disintegrated on impact, fragments tumbling past the bomber's shattered tail. There was no victory in that moment. Only silence, shock, and the terrifying realization that they were still airborne. The remaining crew checked in, voices strained, some barely audible over the wind. Miraculously, no one had been pulled from the aircraft. The rear of the bomber was open to the sky, sunlight pouring in where armor and guns had been seconds earlier. The tail section hung in jagged ruin, held together by twisted metal and torn control lines that should have failed completely. Enemy fighters circled at a distance, assessing the damage. From their vantage point, the bomber should have been falling. Any textbook understanding of aerodynamics said it was finished. A B-17 without a proper tail could not remain controllable. It could not hold altitude. It could not survive turbulence, let alone combat. And yet it did, staggering forward, slow and wounded, refusing to drop. The formation disappeared ahead, shrinking into the haze. The mission objective was gone. Bombs remained on board, unused, their weight now a liability rather than a weapon. The only objective left was survival. Every second in the air was borrowed time, stolen from physics and probability alike. The pilot made the decision without ceremony. Turning back toward friendly territory meant crossing miles of enemy-controlled land in an aircraft that should not exist in flight. Staying on course meant certain destruction. As the bomber creaked and shuddered, struggling to remain level, the crew understood the truth of their situation. This was no longer a combat mission. It was an escape from the impossible, and the sky was not finished testing them yet. the air around the All-American was no longer a battlefield. It was a wreckage field suspended at altitude. Shredded aluminum trailed behind the bomber like torn fabric, vibrating violently in the slipstream. The aircraft fought itself just to remain level, its damaged tail offering almost no stabilizing force. Every minor correction threatened to become a fatal overcorrection. At 20,000 feet, there was no room for error and no margin left to lose. The pilot eased the yoke with movements so small they bordered on instinct rather than intention. Any aggressive input sent the bomber pitching dangerously. The B-17 was no longer flown, it was negotiated with. The co-pilot watched the horizon line tilt and recover in slow, uneven cycles, while the engineer monitored engine temperatures that spiked under constant strain. The bomber's four right cyclones thundered on, unaware that the structure holding them aloft had been fundamentally violated. Behind them, the tail was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The vertical stabilizer that gave the aircraft directional stability had been torn away in the collision. What remained was a jagged stump of fuselage, control cable snapped or hanging loose, hydraulic line severed. The open rear of the bomber roared like a hurricane tunnel, sucking heat, breath, and loose objects toward the void. The temperature inside dropped rapidly. Frost formed on exposed surfaces as oxygen thinned. Enemy fighters closed in again, but their attacks lacked conviction. German pilots flew parallel passes, banking close enough to confirm what their eyes told them, that this aircraft should already be falling. They circled, unsure whether to waste ammunition on something that seemed doomed by gravity alone. Each second they hesitated bought the bomber another second of life. Inside the aircraft, communication became fragmented. Interphone connections cut in and out under vibration. Crewmen leaned close to shout warnings and confirmations directly. The rear gunners' positions were silent, no response, no guns firing, because those stations no longer existed. The crew understood that one more serious maneuver, one sudden gust, or one clean hit would tear the aircraft apart. Below them, flak fire resumed sporadically. Black bursts rose toward the crippled bomber, forcing the pilot to make the smallest possible course adjustments to avoid them. Each correction sent a shudder through the airframe. Rivets strained. Metal groaned. The aircraft protested its own continued existence. The bomber's weight worked against it now. Fully loaded bombs still hung in the bay, dragging the aircraft down, forcing higher engine output just to maintain altitude. Jettisoning them risked destabilizing the bomber further. Keeping them risked an eventual stall. There was no correct choice, only less immediate disaster. The crew's fear was controlled, not absent. Fear sharpened every sense. They felt the vibration through their boots, tasted oil and cordite in the air, smelled overheated engines mixed with cold sky. Each man understood the truth, no manual covered this situation. No instructor had prepared them for an aircraft missing half its body at combat altitude. And still, the bomber flew. The pilot angled the nose slightly west, toward Allied lines. It was a slow turn measured in degrees and seconds, executed with surgical restraint. The horizon shifted. Tunisia slid beneath them. Enemy territory stretched ahead, vast and indifferent. The All-American was alive, but only barely, and the sky had not finished demanding payment for that defiance. The All-American existed in a state that defied both engineering and reason. With nearly half its tail destroyed, the bomber was balanced on a razor's edge of airflow, speed, and restraint. Any sudden movement, an evasive roll, a sharp correction, even turbulence, could send it into an unrecoverable dive. The aircraft was no longer governed by standard controls. It was governed by patience. Inside the cockpit, the pilot maintained a speed just above stall, knowing that slowing down would drop them from the sky, while accelerating too much would tear the weakened structure apart. The control yoke felt loose, imprecise, almost disconnected. The bomber responded late to every input, as if deciding whether obedience was worth the effort. The co-pilot monitored altitude, calling out every small loss, every slight gain, his voice steady but tight. The engineer moved constantly, checking engines, adjusting mixture and propeller pitch to keep thrust even. Any imbalance between the four engines risked yaw the aircraft could no longer counter. Oil pressure fluctuated. Temperatures climbed.
The engines were being asked to compensate for damage they were never designed to survive. Still, they ran.
In the open rear of the fuselage, the wind howled without interruption. Loose gear had already been torn away. The cold was severe now, far beyond discomfort.
Fingers numbed. Breath crystallized in the air.
Crewmen secured themselves to anchor points, aware that a sudden jolt could send them sliding toward open sky. The absence of the tail gunner's compartment was a constant, silent reminder of how close they were to annihilation.
Enemy fighters reappeared briefly, testing the bomber's reactions. They fired probing bursts, then broke away. The All-American did not maneuver to avoid them, it could not. Its survival depended on appearing already dead. The German pilots, trained to recognize doomed aircraft, seemed reluctant to close in on something that looked moments from disintegration.
The bomber's refusal to fall became its shield. Below, the ground crept by.
Roads. Fields. Small clusters of buildings. Every mile crossed was a mile stolen.
But the greatest danger was not enemy fire.
It was the aircraft itself.
Metal fatigue spread invisibly through stress joints. The bomber vibrated continuously, a low-frequency shudder that traveled through the crew's bones. Each second raised the question of when, not if, something critical would finally give way. The pilot ordered the bombs jettisoned. The release was executed with agonizing care. When the payload dropped free, the aircraft lurched upward unexpectedly, nose rising faster than planned. For a heartbeat, control was nearly lost. The pilot eased the yoke forward, fighting the sudden change. The bomber settled again, lighter but still unstable. They had traded one danger for another and survived the exchange.
Fuel calculations were grim. Detours were impossible. Altitude changes were risky. The route home had to be direct, regardless of what lay beneath. Friendly territory was still far away, separated by enemy airspace and time the aircraft might not have. Every man aboard understood that there would be no second chance. No emergency landing behind lines. No bailout at this altitude and speed. Survival depended on holding together long enough to reach safety. As the bomber pushed westward, engines straining, structure trembling, one truth became unavoidable.
The All-American was no longer flying toward home. It was racing against the moment it finally stopped flying at all. The B-17 was no longer governed by design. It was governed by compromise. Every law of aerodynamics the crew had learned was now an obstacle they had to work around rather than rely on. Without its tail, the bomber behaved like a wounded animal, unpredictable, unstable, and capable of sudden collapse if pushed too far. The airframe flexed under stress, metal joints straining with every vibration as if the aircraft were breathing through broken ribs. The pilot kept his eyes locked on the horizon, using it as the only reliable reference left. Instruments lagged or lied. The artificial horizon wobbled. The airspeed needle trembled. What mattered was feel, the subtle pressure in the controls, the pitch of the engines, the sound of airflow tearing through the fuselage. He flew by instinct sharpened through months of combat flying, making corrections measured in millimeters rather than inches. Inside the aircraft, physics became the enemy. Turbulence rolled in from rising heat off the desert below, lifting one wing while dropping the other. Normally, the tail would dampen the motion. Now, every gust threatened to twist the bomber into a fatal oscillation. The co-pilot called out altitude changes, his voice steady as the aircraft lost 50 feet, then clawed it back. The engineer adjusted throttle settings continuously, fighting asymmetrical thrust that tried to yaw the bomber sideways. The crew redistributed weight where they could. Ammunition boxes were shifted. Loose equipment was secured or thrown overboard. Every pound mattered. Every imbalance carried consequences the bomber could not correct on its own. The aircraft's center of gravity had moved dangerously forward, forcing the pilot to maintain constant back pressure on the controls just to keep the nose from dropping. Cold seeped deeper into the aircraft. At altitude, the open fuselage turned the bomber into a wind tunnel. Frost-coated exposed wiring. Condensation froze along the edges of torn metal. Crewmen's faces were stiff with cold, eyes burning from wind and oxygen masks.
Hands ached as they worked, clumsy but determined, performing tasks that kept the aircraft marginally alive. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes felt like hours. The bomber crawled westward at reduced speed, unable to risk faster flight. Fuel burned steadily. There was no reserve. No alternate route. The African coastline still lay ahead, distant and uncertain.
Radio silence was maintained.
Broadcasting their condition risked drawing attention they could not afford.
Below them, anti-aircraft fire flared again from a scattered position. The pilot adjusted course by degrees, threading a path that avoided sharp maneuvers.
Black bursts bloomed close enough to pepper the fuselage with fragments.
Each impact sent a shudder through the structure, threatening to unravel what little integrity remained.
The bomber endured, absorbing punishment it had no right to survive.
The crew worked in near silence now. Words were unnecessary. Every man understood his role in keeping the aircraft balanced between flight and collapse. Fear was present, but controlled.
Panic had no utility here. Precision did.
Then the aircraft lurched violently as a sudden downdraft grabbed it, dropping the nose and increasing airspeed beyond safe limits. The weakened structure groaned in protest. The pilot fought the dive carefully, easing back just enough to recover without tearing the bomber apart. For several long seconds, the All-American hovered on the edge of catastrophe, caught between gravity and restraint, before leveling out once more.
The crew knew the truth then.
They were not just flying home. They were actively preventing the sky from killing them.
The All-American pressed on across enemy-held Tunisia with no formation, no escort, and no reliable control.
Below, Axis positions dotted the landscape, airfields, supply roads, gun pits, each one capable of ending the flight with a single well-placed burst.
The bomber's altitude was steadily decreasing, not by choice but by necessity.
Holding height required power and stability the aircraft no longer possessed. Every mile forward was paid for with fuel, metal, and nerve. The pilot flew a shallow, deliberate line west, avoiding known concentrations of anti-aircraft fire by memory alone.
Maps were useless now. Deviations demanded turns the bomber could not safely make.
The co-pilot scanned the terrain for movement while calling out altitude losses in clipped intervals.
100 feet gone.
Another 50 clawed back. The aircraft was slowly descending through layers of warmer air, turbulence easing but danger increasing as ground fire grew more accurate. Small caliber tracers reached up from below, thin white threads arcing past the wings.
The pilot refused to evade. Any abrupt maneuver risked structural failure.
The bomber absorbed the threat by ignoring it, trusting speed and altitude just enough to keep distance.
Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage. One engine cowling took a hit, dented but intact.
The engineer adjusted power again, keeping the four engines matched as closely as possible. The open rear of the aircraft remained a constant roar. The crew worked with their backs to empty sky, clipped in, braced against sudden shifts.
The absence of defensive fire from the rear marked the bomber as wounded. Enemy gunners below could see it.
So could fighters circling at the edge of visibility, tracking patiently, waiting for the moment gravity finished the job. Radio silence continued.
Calling for help would only draw attention.
Allied fighters were unlikely to reach them in time anyway. This part of the sky belonged to the enemy, and the bomber was trespassing alone. Fuel gauges crept downward. Consumption was higher than planned due to constant power adjustments.
There would be no loitering, no second approach to safety. The African coastline finally appeared ahead, a thin, pale line separating desert from sea.
It was still distant, but it was real. The crew allowed themselves no celebration.
Between them and water lay the last belt of enemy defenses.
Flak guns positioned near roads and rail lines sent up probing fire, black bursts blossoming closer than before. The pilot adjusted heading by fractions, slipping through gaps as if threading a needle at speed. The bomber descended further, now below 15,000 feet.
Air density increased. Control improved slightly, enough to offer hope and enough to tempt fate.
The pilot resisted the urge to push harder.
Survival depended on restraint. The engines droned unevenly, one beginning to show signs of strain under sustained load.
The engineer watched the gauges without blinking. Then a shadow crossed the cockpit glass. A single fighter, low and fast, passing beneath them before climbing away.
It did not attack. It did not need to. The message was clear. They were being watched. Timed. Counted. As the bomber crossed the coastline, the Mediterranean opened beneath them, wide and unforgiving.
Friendly territory lay somewhere beyond the water, but the aircraft was bleeding altitude and time at the same rate.
The sea offered no mercy to damaged bombers.
The All-American cleared enemy land, but the most dangerous part of the journey was still ahead, and the aircraft was running out of everything except determination.
Over the Mediterranean, the bomber entered a different kind of danger.
The land fell away behind them, but the sea offered no refuge, only distance, cold, and consequences.
There would be no forced landing on water in this condition. The All-American could not survive impact.
It could barely survive air. The aircraft pressed on, low and slow, engines droning unevenly as if aware they were the last barrier between flight and oblivion.
The pilot adjusted heading by instinct, aligning the bomber with the faint outline of Allied coastline far ahead. Navigation instruments were secondary now. Wind drift mattered more. Engine sound mattered more.
The bomber's altitude hovered just above the point where recovery would be impossible if lift failed. The co-pilot tracked fuel burn, his calculations grim but precise. The margin was thin, but it existed.
Barely.
Inside the aircraft, fatigue began to bite.
Adrenaline had carried the crew through the worst moments over enemy territory.
Now, with the immediate threat receding, exhaustion crept in. Muscles trembled from hours of tension.
Hands ached from constant pressure.
Faces were stiff with cold and strain.
No one spoke unless necessary. Conversation invited distraction, and distraction could kill them. The engines began to show it.
One coughed briefly, a sharp interruption in the steady roar. The engineer adjusted mixture, watching pressure stabilize again. Every fluctuation carried weight.
Losing an engine now would mean asymmetric thrust the bomber could not correct.
The pilot resisted every instinct to climb, knowing that altitude cost power they did not have. Clouds gathered ahead, low and scattered.
Normally, cloud cover offered concealment. Now, it represented risk.
Entering turbulence without tail stability was dangerous.
Skirting the edges meant small course changes that taxed the airframe.
The pilot chose the lesser threat, guiding the bomber along the smoothest air he could find, threading between layers with the patience of a surgeon. The Mediterranean rolled beneath them, dark and endless. Sunlight reflected off the water in blinding patches, forcing squints behind goggles. The bomber cast a long, broken shadow across the sea, a reminder of how incomplete it truly was. Somewhere below, ships moved Allied and enemy alike, but none close enough to matter. The All-American was alone in its struggle. Fuel gauges dipped toward their final markings.
The engineer recalculated silently. They would make it or they would not. There was no reserve left to bargain with.
The engines ran hotter now, pushed beyond comfortable limits. Oil streaked back along nacelles, visible even from the cockpit. The aircraft vibrated continuously, a living thing held together by stressed metal and stubborn refusal. Then the coastline grew clearer.
Friendly territory. Allied ground.
Airfields somewhere beyond the horizon. The pilot allowed himself a single controlled breath. They were close, but not close enough to relax. Landings killed damaged aircraft as surely as combat. The bomber still had to descend. It still had to line up. It still had to survive its final test. As the All-American crossed into Allied airspace, radio silence broke briefly. Identification codes were transmitted. No celebration followed. Control remained tenuous. The aircraft was bleeding airspeed and altitude, its structure trembling with every mile gained. Home was no longer impossible. But the most dangerous maneuver of the entire flight still waited ahead, one that would decide whether this aircraft's story ended in legend, or in wreckage on friendly ground. The airfield came into view like a promise that could still be broken. A strip of hard-packed earth and steel matting stretched across the landscape, surrounded by tents, fuel drums, and parked aircraft. Ground crews paused their work as the damaged bomber appeared on the horizon, its silhouette wrong in a way that drew eyes instantly. No B-17 was meant to look like that and still be flying. The pilot began the descent with extreme caution. Reducing power too quickly risked a stall the aircraft could not recover from. Holding speed too long risked structural failure on approach. Every foot of altitude lost was deliberate, every adjustment slow and restrained. The co-pilot called airspeed continuously. The engineer watched engine gauges like a man counting down a fuse. Inside the bomber, the crew prepared for impact, not a crash, but a landing that could become one without warning. Loose gear was secured. Men braced themselves. The open rear fuselage screamed louder as airflow changed, wind clawing through the aircraft with renewed force. The bomber's nose dipped slightly, then steadied. Control was marginal, but it existed. Below, personnel on the ground began to scatter into position. Fire crews rolled out, anticipating the worst. Ambulances idled. Officers watched through binoculars, unable to look away. They had seen damaged aircraft attempt landings before. They had also seen how often those attempts ended in wreckage. The pilot aligned with the runway using shallow corrections, keeping wings as level as possible. Without a tail, even minor yaw threatened to turn into a ground loop on touchdown. The bomber descended lower. Airspeed hovered at the minimum needed to stay airborne. The engines roared unevenly, strained but obedient. The ground rushed closer. Dust kicked up beneath the wheels as the aircraft crossed the threshold. The pilot held the bomber just above the surface, bleeding speed carefully. Too high and they would drop hard. Too low and they would stall short. The moment stretched, unbearable in its precision. Then the wheels touched. The impact was firm but controlled. The bomber bounced once, tailless structure flexing violently. The pilot held the nose straight, fighting yaw with limited control. The co-pilot called speed. The engineer cut power gradually, avoiding sudden changes that could twist the aircraft sideways. The bomber rolled, unstable but upright, its damaged rear threatening to overtake the front with every vibration. Brakes engaged carefully. Too much pressure risked collapse. Too little risked overrunning the field. Dust and debris billowed around the aircraft as it slowed, metal groaning in protest. Ground crews ran alongside, waving, shouting, some unable to believe what they were seeing. At last, the bomber rolled to a stop. Silence followed, broken only by cooling engines ticking and the rush of wind through torn metal. For a moment, no one moved. The aircraft stood intact, wounded but alive. The crew remained in their seats, breathing hard, letting the reality settle in. When they finally climbed out, the scale of the damage became undeniable. The rear of the aircraft was gone. Not damaged, gone. Men on the ground stared openly. Some reached out to touch the jagged edges, as if confirming it was real. The All-American had landed in full view of witnesses who understood exactly how impossible it was. But as the dust settled and engines fell silent, one truth remained unresolved. Survival was no longer in question. What this flight meant for air combat, for engineering, and for history was only just beginning to be understood. In the hours after the landing, the airfield became a place of quiet reckoning. Mechanics, engineers, and officers gathered around the All-American, walking its length slowly, tracing damage with their eyes and hands. The rear fuselage was torn away to the point where doctrine said the aircraft should never have remained airborne. Control surfaces were gone. Structural members were exposed. Control cables hung uselessly. And yet the bomber had crossed enemy territory, open sea, and landed intact. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. Reports written with a mixture of disbelief and precision. What had returned was not just a damaged aircraft, it was evidence. Evidence that the B-17 Flying Fortress possessed a level of structural resilience no one had fully understood. The engineers studied stress points. They examined how the wings had continued to generate lift, how the remaining surfaces had compensated, how the pilot's restraint had allowed the airframe to survive forces it was never designed to endure. Word spread quickly through units and command channels. Crews gathered to see it for themselves. Men who had watched bombers fall apart under lesser damage stood in silence before this one. The lesson was immediate and unavoidable. Formation bombing relied on discipline, but survival also relied on airframes that could absorb punishment and keep flying. The B-17 was no longer just a bomber. It was proof that American air power could take hits meant to destroy it and continue forward. The crew was debriefed carefully. Their actions were dissected not for heroics, but for understanding. How speed had been managed. How turns had been avoided. How engines had been balanced to compensate for missing control authority. Their experience became instruction. Their restraint became doctrine. This was how crews would be taught to survive damage no manual had anticipated. The All-American never returned to combat. Its war was over, but its purpose was not. It became a reference point, a tangible reminder that survivability mattered as much as firepower. Future missions would be planned with renewed confidence, not arrogance, but trust in the machines and the men who flew them. Trust that endurance could change outcomes. Beyond the technical lessons, something quieter endured. For the crews who saw that bomber land, the impossible became real. Fear shifted shape. It did not disappear, but it was tempered by knowledge. Knowledge that even in the worst conditions, survival could be earned through discipline, teamwork, and refusal to panic. The war would continue with greater violence and greater cost. Bombers would still be lost. Crews would still fall. But the legacy of that flight remained, woven into the identity of American air power. It was not about invulnerability. It was about resilience, the ability to take damage, adapt, and finish the mission of coming home. The All-American stood silent on the field, broken but unbowed. Its story was carried forward by every crew that climbed into a bomber afterward, by every pilot who trusted their aircraft just a little more when the sky turned hostile. In the history of World War II aviation, many machines destroyed the enemy. This one redefined what it meant to survive them.